And thank you, Guy, for joining us today. And I hand it off to you.
Thank you, Sonia. Thank you for this invitation to share with your class. I've got some slides I'm going to share, so let me please do that. Human performance technology from an L&D practitioner's perspective. Thank you, Sonia, again for inviting me to speak to your class today and in 2 days. So I've been in the instructional design business for quite a while, and what I'm going to talk about is where the majority of human performance technology meets my instructional systems design or learning and development workflow, otherwise back in the day known as processes. This presentation is going to be made available to Sonia as a PDF and as a PowerPoint slide, so there's no need to take what we used to call back in the day copious notes. I know technology does that for you nowadays, so I'm a little bit not caught up to all of that. So my agenda is I'm going to talk about my mental models, my frameworks for ISD. These are known as the PAC processes. It's simply my brand for my version of, if you will, an ADDIE-like approach to instructional systems design or instructional design. And I'm going to talk a little bit about human performance technology, which I've branded as EPI, Enterprise Process Performance Improvement. Again, there's a lot of different models like this. You should learn one and then go learn all the rest of them and then make your own version of this. And then we'll do a little Q&A after that. So back in 1979, I got out of college with my radio, TV, film degree and went to work for Wicks Lumber in Saginaw, Michigan. I'd been working for them as an inside salesperson at their lumber center in Lawrence, Kansas. I was going to the University of Kansas. Um, and it was there that on day one I learned about some major gurus in the HPT world. I learned about Gary Rumler. I learned about Tom Gilbert. I learned about Bob Mager. And later in that week, I learned about Joe Harless. Now, the people that I went to work for, my boss and my co-worker, we were a three-person unit in a 10-person training services function. They had just come from Blue Cross Blue Shield of Detroit 2 weeks before I got there in August of 1979. And they had worked with Gary Rumler's brother. And they were implementing the things that Rumler and Gilbert were creating in their consulting business, known as Praxis, from the late 60s through the late 70s. And so I was immediately oriented to a performance orientation for this thing that used to be called training, was too often mislabeled as training when it was really education, and nowadays is known as learning. Uh, I spent less than 2 years there, and I went to work at Motorola in Schaumburg, Illinois. And there I got to work with Gary Rumler. He was my consultant, and as the joke went, I carried his pencils around as we went from my client to another client to another client. But I was very, very lucky to have been oriented to his work, his methodologies, and then to be able to see it in action as we traveled all over North America to all the Motorola sites. There were over 30 of them, doing work for the manufacturing materials and purchasing functions within the company. Then in November 82, I became a consultant with a small consulting firm. I was the fourth person on the payroll. And then I helped grow the business and I became a partner in what later became Svensson and Wallace Incorporated. And it started off as R.A. Svensson, another luminary from the HPT world. He was a Bell Labs engineer who had been put in charge of strategic planning for training and development at all of the AT&T major facilities where they were focused on training their workforce. Um, I've had a lot of clients, 83 clients over the years. These are the majority of my work was with Amoco and AT&T, a company called Bandag, Eli Lilly, General Dynamics, General Motors, Hewlett Packard, Illinois Bell, MCC Powers, but I crossed many different industries using my standard approach for instructional systems design, which was focused on performance. What do we want people to be able to do? Because what do we want them to be able to produce? Doing things is a means to the ends of producing things. Knowledge and skills via training, formal learning, informal learning, etc., is a means to the ends of being able to perform tasks, behavioral tasks, and cognitive tasks in order to produce what Gilbert called worthy accomplishments, or what Rumler would have called worthy outputs. So my thing is that, people are on the payroll to produce worthy outputs. They're not there to just do things. They're there to produce outputs, which generally are inputs downstream, either inside the company or outside the company, depending on where people sit and what their role is. But it's all about performance competence. That's the ability to perform tasks to produce outputs. And those outputs are measured by stakeholder requirements. In the stakeholder hierarchy, I wrote an article for a quality journal back in the mid 90s about stakeholders. And anyway, so this is a model. It's for illustrative purposes only. Your situation may vary, but basically, the late Roger Kaufman would have said we're working for society at large, so they're the ultimate stakeholder. Well, usually it's really government and the regulatory agencies, and you either do things within their regulatory requirements, or you're toast, you're out of business, you're fined, whatever. Underneath them, the next level on the stakeholder hierarchy are owners and shareholders. They own the company. They don't want you to bankrupt them. They want to make a decent profit, et cetera, et cetera. There's usually a board of directors, and there's executives, there's management, there's the customers who kind of lean to the right because they lead the definition of requirements. But yet, if the government says you should not ever do that or we'll fine you and throw you all in jail, of course, the customer isn't king. The regulators are. So then there's the employees, and basically employees are there to serve the customers. That's why the graphic looks the way it was. Suppliers, we outsource things that we don't want our employees to do or don't have the expertise to do. They kind of follow on. They don't get to set the requirements necessarily. And then at the bottom of the pyramid, there's the community at large, which, if the community at large voices their demands, their requirements, their unhappiness loudly enough, they become society at the top, right? And they influence the government and blah, 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 blah. Anyway, so that's the notion behind how I looked at stakeholder requirements, because performance is really all about the outputs, with tasks and the knowledge and skills simply as enablers, which are means to the ends of those outputs. Performance improvement measures centers on the process and the workflows. That's where tasks happen. And the outputs are hopefully being produced better, faster, and cheaper, in layman's terms, or as the quality movement put it back in the 70s, quality, quantity, and cost. Those are the key measures of performance. If you're not measuring that out in the workplace, then you're not really measuring impact of learning and development. So I've got three themes I want to tie together, kind of, and that's that a request for L&D for new hires should be expected. But a request for L&D for solving performance problems should be suspected. The data has shown fairly clearly that the numbers vary slightly, but 80% of the time it's not got anything to do, a performance problem or an opportunity, with knowledge and skills. It's usually something else. And I was taught back in my first week on the job in August 1979 that it's just as important for us to steer the client away from training when it's not going to have an impact, when it's not going to address the root causes of a problem, as it is to do stellar training. So it's just as important to avoid it when it's not going to have any impact, and it's going to be squandering shareholder equity and wasting everybody's time, including the learners. And so we shouldn't do that. But there's a lot of noise, if you will, about don't be an order taker. Well, the late Joe Harless talked about this at NSPI, which is now ISPI, at a conference back in the mid 80s, when he said, when your client comes to you and asks you for training, don't say in your whiniest voice, Are you sure it's a training problem? He did not like that notion. No service provider support function should be pushing back on a request. I say in either case, take the order for the new hires or for the performance problems, and then make sure that you follow up in your order fulfillment process, Addy or SAM or whatever model you're using to frame your projects. You've got to have an analysis effort or a discovery effort that determines what are the desired required processes and outputs and what are the current state gaps against those. Now, for new hires, they need to know here's the barriers to performance in the road that you're going to have to navigate. You're going to have to try to avoid them. But if they are unavoidable, here's how you recover quickly because the world doesn't work real smoothly. It's not rote performance most of the time. There's sometimes variations in the performance context, and new hires need to be prepared for that, how to navigate that. And of course, if there's a performance problem, we want to understand what's the root of it. It may be that the data people are working with is bad, and the materials that they're working with are bad, and the tools and equipment that are working are bad, and training isn't going to solve any of that, but it could forewarn people on how to mitigate those if it's mitigatable. And who else would know that but perhaps master performers that you would talk to, interview in the analysis process. The second point here is that if the performance context demands a memorized performance response, there ain't no time to look anything up. You better know it off the top of your head. It's life and death or whatever. Then we need to develop performance-based learning experiences. We really need to hone that performance response so that people have that at the ready. And if it's something that they're going to do then often on the job, then we don't need spaced learning. But if it's something that's going to come up rarely or unpredictably, then we may need to do space learning to keep it ever fresh, ever at the ready in the performer's repertoire. But if the performance context allows a reference performance response, hey, you can take some time and look that up and make sure you get it right, then we shouldn't be developing performance-based learning experience where we're forcing people to memorize things that out in the real world, they don't have to memorize. They can look it up. They can look at what Rumler and Gilbert back in the 60s called guidance, or later on, when 9 years later, I was I was taught it was not guidance, but it was called job aids. Now it's electronic performance support, performance support. It's got a whole bunch of different names. It's kind of the equivalent of having an SOP, standard operating procedure, in your hand to guide your performance, or the instructions if you're assembling a shelf. So for high stakes performance where the risks and or rewards are high, we want to provide learning experiences with sufficient practice with feedback so people can really hone that knowledge and skill, the ability to perform. Um, if it's something where we're really going to rely on a reference, like a performance support or guidance or a job aid, then we may still want to deliver that to the audience, the target audience, the performers, via a learning experience. So we teach them how to use that performance guide and master the job. So, in my experience since 1979, the vast majority of things that I've analyzed could have fallen into the second camp. The performance context, the environment allows people to look things up and then perform. It didn't have to be on demand, immediate, etc. Now, if the worst case scenario is, once in a blue moon, you have to have that memorized, most of the time you can reference it, but sometimes you got to have it memorized. Then the default is it needs to be memorized. And therefore, you need a learning experience and probably spaced learning to reinforce that and keep that in people's minds. So, memorized performance responses are important, but they're the minority. Reference performance responses, in my experience, and your experiences and your future experiences may differ, but you need to be wary of that. We have for too long forced people to memorize things that weren't necessary. Again, this is the stakeholder hierarchy I covered a little bit before. Stakeholders establish, is the output good or not? How do you know a good output from a bad output? How do you know if the process was good or not? Well, most organizations nowadays have metrics or KPIs, et cetera, for processes and their outputs. But in my experience, when I would assemble a team of master performers and other subject matter experts to review the performance that's already been documented and to fill in the holes, et cetera, they most often told me that the KPIs were garbage. They were built by committee, they didn't reflect the reality, and who would know better than a master performer, somebody who's mastered the job and is recognized as such. So politically, you might have to take the KPIs and begin to work with them, but you need to confirm that they are the real world requirements, that they reflect those real world requirements, and then you can use them. Because in training or education or learning and development, we need to prepare people to produce outputs to standard, to those stakeholder requirements. Now, again, my HPT models, I call them EPI, blah, blah, blah. And it starts on the left there with there's inputs, there's the processes, and there's the outputs. And we need to understand that. We need to understand what are people trying to produce? How are they going about producing it? What inputs do they need in order to really adequately conduct the process? And then there are enablers of the process. There are human enablers and there are environmental enablers. Now, I don't know what size screen you're looking at, so sorry for those of you who've got this on a large enough screen to read this, but I'm going to read these. The human enablers are awareness, knowledge, and skills. I don't always need a skill. Sometimes I just need some knowledge because I have the skill, it's close enough, but now there's new knowledge and I can take that new knowledge and apply it skillfully in the process. Sometimes I just need to be made aware of certain things. I don't need deep knowledge on anything, and I don't need skills training. I just need to know what the new change is, and then I can fold that into my repertoire of performance and then perform adequately. But there's also the human brings physical attributes, physical strength, eyesight, etc. Psychological attributes. I can take rejection all day long, so I can be in your sales organization where we know that only 1 out of 27 sales calls results in a sales. Very depressing unless you're steeled against that psychologically. There's intellectual attributes where I can be a strategic planner and a concrete thinker all in one job, or maybe we can't find enough people who can think strategically and concretely. And then there's personal values. Sometimes people don't have the personal values that are required to perform adequately in a job. There's more than just knowledge and skills. Knowledge and skills is handled by the learning and development function, whatever it's called. And the rest of these other attributes should be handled by the recruiting and selection department. And sometimes during analysis, you find out from the master performers that the new people that are being brought into the job don't have the right stuff. And sometimes that right stuff are some of these other attributes. So learning and development is not going to be able to solve that problem, but it might be, hopefully, it's of interest to your clients and stakeholders so that they can see that maybe we do need some learning, but we need to change our recruiting and selection criteria. And then there's the environmental enablers: data and information, materials and supplies, tools and equipment, facilities and grounds, budget and headcount, culture and consequences. One of the most important things I learned from Gary Rumler is that the first thing he would look at when he's looking at a performance problem, he would look at the process. Is there one? Yes or no? If there is one, is it being uh, reflected in people's work? Are they following the process? Yes or no? And if not, why not? So that would be the first thing you'd look at. You'd say the majority of the time it was the process. There wasn't one, or people weren't following it. They were making up their own. They were shortcutting it, whatever. And therein lies the root cause of the performance problem. He would say then that the second thing he would look at would be the culture and consequences. Do the consequences for good performance punish the performer? Do we give our best workers more work than anybody else and therefore punish them? And if they're smart, they'll wise up and they'll start slacking off and perform just like everybody else. So we need to be looking at those kinds of variables when we're looking at a performance problem. Then the rest of my model here is that so if you've uncovered some of the root causes, and there's usually more than one, where do you go to get these things fixed? Well, if it's data and information, you go to the information and data systems, which is not just necessarily the IT department. Data and information that feeds processes may come from many different sources in an enterprise. And so we've got to figure out, well, what's the bad data? Where's it coming from? How do we swim upstream, so to speak, and get to those people to make sure that they can fix their processes to produce outputs that are inputs to our process, the ones that we're focused on, because they are at the root of the performance problem downstream in the process boxes that we're looking at. So this is my adaptation of ADDIE. I adapted this in 1982 when I became a consultant, and I was put in charge of the firm's instructional systems design practice area, the training practice area. And so I kick off ADDIE, if you will, with project planning and kickoff, which includes the intake process, the request intake process. Do a project plan and then kick off the project and get it resourced by the stakeholders. And then you do analysis, design, and development. And then I extracted pilot tests from the old development models because I wanted to make a bigger deal out of the first delivery of this as a full destructive pilot test. And then we do whatever revisions necessary, and then we'd release the instruction to whatever LMS or however it was going to be deployed. I also do curriculum architecture design, and so I have a similar set of processes, workflows, if you will, for doing that. But in both instructional architecture and instructional development of either performance guides and or learning experiences, I do four types of analysis. I do target audience analysis. I want to know what the body count is, where they are geographically dispersed across the planet. I need to know what are their typical incoming knowledge and skills from past experience and education. And then I need to all, but I can't finish the target analysis until I finish the next two. What is the performance that's what we're looking at? Are we looking at a process? Are we looking at a job title? Are we looking at a function? What are all the workflows or processes? What's the performance, human tasks, cognitive tasks involved in all of that? What are the outputs to produce? Where are we currently doing okay generally? Where are we not doing okay? Where are the current state gaps, if you will? And then I want to do, based on that, I want to do a knowledge and skill analysis. I want to systematically derive the enabling knowledge and skills required by the performance requirements. Then I want to also look at existing content to see what do we already have in place, training programs, education programs, instructional programs, brochures, materials, what do we have that we might be able to reuse um, as is or reuse after modification, or what do we have that we should get rid of because it's not current, it's out of date, or it's just wrong. And so once I understand the performance requirements of the knowledge and skill analysis, I can begin to look at what the target audience, the incoming target audience, already knows and can do based on education and experience. And therefore, we shouldn't force people through learning experiences that they can already master. We need to let them pre-test out or do something here to avoid squandering shareholder equity by wasting it that way. So this is how these things kind of line up. The ideal outputs and the ideal process tasks and the current state gaps from the stakeholder requirements should be driving the knowledge and skill requirements. I want to really understand performance adequately before I start asking, well, what do you got to know to be able to do that? Because if I don't do this adequately, I'm going to miss some of the key stakeholder knowledge and skill requirements. And that just causes gap in whatever set of curricula, whatever set of learning and development modules, et cetera, that I might produce. So job assignments, just because people have the same job title doesn't mean they have the same job assignments back on the job. We need to understand what those differences are so that we can modularize our content so we can configure our content to help people avoid what they don't need, and so that they can get what they do need. And we understand how our target audience's job responsibilities vary job to job to job. We also need to understand these incoming knowledge and skills based on the education and experiences. Again, one of the complaints that we used to have back in the day was that people were forced through training. It was mandated, and they didn't need it because it wasn't part of their job or they already knew it. You can review these questions later when you get the PDF of, if you are so desirous of, when I send this out. But basically, this is how I chunk out the areas of performance, also known as major duties, key results areas, Gilbert's word accomplishments. But within that, there's outputs that are produced, there are measures, there's standards to those measures, there's the tasks that are performed, and there's various roles and responsibilities. Most complex performance isn't done by an individual all by themselves. They're working in collaboration with others, so it helps to clarify, well, who's doing what? What's our target audience doing, and what are other people doing? And just so that's clear, in terms of people not staying in their own lane and not trying to do other people's jobs. These are the typical questions that I ask for doing a gap analysis. And again, you can look at this later. And these are my knowledge and skill categories. Yes, there are 17 distinct knowledge and skill categories. And these are the questions I ask about that as I systematically derive the enabling knowledge and skills. Because if I'm here for learning and development purposes, I'm really trying to uncover what are the priority knowledge and skills that are required of people in order to be able to perform. This is the format that I use to capture the performance requirements. It's got it for every area of performance. It identifies outputs, measures, tasks, roles, responsibilities, typical performance gaps, probable gap causes. This is what it looks like on a flip chart, a double wide flip chart page when you've produced this data using a facilitated group process. That was always my preference. I didn't always get to do it. Sometimes I had to do the old individual interviews, document reviews, observations, and then I'd have to go around and reconcile the differences that I got from different people. But if I always put them in a room together, we could negotiate those differences and get that out on the piece of paper, which often gets to look very messy. This is an example from 1986. I've been producing these kinds of models since 1979, as taught by others who were influenced by the Gary Rumler approach to things. So, but this is what it looks like. And at the very right-hand side there's the deficiency causes. And back in the day, we used to say there was a deficiency of the environmental supports or a deficiency of knowledge and skills. Nowadays, I have a couple other types of deficiencies. But the important point of this is to begin to get the people that I'm working with, including the client and stakeholders, to a point of understanding that some of the problems are not caused by a knowledge and skill deficit, and so training won't fix it. So what would fix these other things that are DEs? It's outside my scope of responsibility as a training and development person or a learning and development person, but it's important that I get this to the client. The gaps in their causes. This is what I really am focusing on most of the time with my clients. And when I get to that point of my ADDIE-like process, at the end of the analysis phase, I have a gate review meeting, as evidenced by the upside down stoplights. It's a go light I'm looking for. But at the end of the analysis phase, when I'm reviewing the analysis data, most of the time formally in a formal meeting with my client and the key stakeholders, generally the managers of the target audience, several layers up, it's the L&D pivot point where I'm trying to influence the stakeholders and their decision as to, do we continue with learning and development, creating content? If that's not going to solve the problem, why would we do that? Maybe we need to pivot to a non-instructional intervention. Maybe we need to fix the data systems and the tools and equipment that people have. Maybe that's all that's needed. And maybe those things are needed plus learning and development. But anyway, I'm trying to influence the client so that I can inform their business decision making, because it is a business decision to continue, to pivot, or to do both. Here's where a request for new hires should be expected in a request for problem solving. You don't say, "Are you sure it's a training problem, a knowledge and skill problem?" You say, "Yes, I can help you. Let me do that by ensuring that we conduct a quick but adequate analysis effort to get to the root of this." We have to understand the knowledge and skills required, but we should understand what these gaps are in the current state. Because either we have to prepare the new hire for dealing with those gaps, because they ain't going to go away by themselves, or the client engages others to fix the upstream problems that are causing the gaps in what we're focused on. So if the memorized performance response is required, then we have to, again, produce a learning experience that addresses how to perform given the gaps, given the ideal state, and whenever the ideal state is not there and it's something less than ideal. And if we can provide guidance so people don't have to impossibly memorize all sorts of detailed things, we should give them something that's the equivalent of a SOP, standard operating procedure, that accounts for the variations, because if it's raining outside, you may need to do performance a little bit differently than if it's a sunny day. And we always have to be cognizant of who the stakeholders are and what their requirements are, because success by performers in the performance context depends on them meeting those stakeholder requirements for the outputs they produce and how they go about producing them. I saw in some of your suggested readings, I don't think it was mandatory, suggested readings was this book, and I happen to have produced chapter 11 in this book. And my chapter 11 was modeling mastery performance, which I've talked about, and systematically deriving the enablers for performance improvement. We didn't get into too much depth on that side of it. But basically, I've got a 25-page PDF you can get for free, and you can read that in detail if you're so inclined. I have these 4 books, and just last week I put 26 additional books of mine for free available at my professional archive, if you will, as I'm a retired guy, retired in 3 years ago. Been writing about quality and the intersection with TQM, total quality management, and HPT, human performance technology, for a long time. The first book I produced with my business partners back in '94, The Quality Roadmap. I've got these other books that also address these kinds of topics. I've got a audio podcast on Spotify, and now we're here ready to entertain your questions.
Thank you so much. That was so amazing to hear your background and to see how you've applied it. And I hear similar phrases that we have seen all semester. So there's definitely coherence in how we've explored our journeys.
I've stolen from the best. So,
Well, that's it. So I have a few questions.
sure.
However, I'd like to open up the floor to the students and give preference to their questions. But I've got some standing by just in case. Anybody have questions? Helen. So introduce yourself first, then go into the question.
Hi, Guy. Thank you so much for coming and taking the time to talk to us and impart your wisdom. Yeah, my name's Helen. One of Sonia's students from 2 of her classes this term. My question for you is about analysis. Because you really stressed today that analysis is important to make sure that you're finding like the exact problem or like where the gaps are. And you said it was quick. However, you described a lot that was going on in analysis, and I was wondering, in like the real world, beyond the classroom experience, how much time is often allowed by an organization for the analysis stage? Because I imagine a lot of places are like, we want the problem fixed now. Like, we want you to give us solutions now.
Yesterday.
So I was wondering what the expectation is.
Yeah. So, in all fairness, Since 82, I've been an external consultant, so I've developed a
Mm.
project plan and given people a price for that. And it always included the time necessary for analysis. And the only negotiable about that was how will we conduct the analysis?
Okay.
I can bring your master performers and other key subject matter experts, somebody from regulatory affairs who doesn't know the process but knows the regulations. So they need to, if I could get those people in a room for 3 days, I can be done with the analysis in 3 days. Otherwise, it's going to take 3 weeks,
Mm.
3 months, depending on how soon I can get to the right people. And I don't know who they are. So you, the client, and the project steering team that I tried to assemble with the key
Hmm.
stakeholders,
Hmm.
they need to give up the right people at the right time to do the right things, and so the schedule depend is going to depend on their ability to get those people
Yeah.
lined up for me. So,
Ah, okay.
but when
Okay.
you're inside a company, there are expectations of this is how we do it. We don't do analysis because that's just analysis paralysis, which is when people don't know what data they're looking for. So one of the things I've used to clients, even in the project steering teams, where they push back on me wanting to do analysis and they just wanted me to get on with development, skip design. Um, well, I would say, my sneaky trick was that I would start conducting the analysis with them. So what are the outputs for produced? How do you know a good one from a bad one? What are the current state gaps? And then we'd get to what are the knowledge and skills. And pretty soon somebody in the room would say, these are really good questions, but we don't have a clue.
Mm.
All right, so maybe we let Guy go do this, and so that's often it's often enough been the case for me. Not on repeat business because clients go, hey, I want more of that. So I did a project back in 2013. I was brought in as a subcontractor, and the clients had said, "Well, I'll give you 3 days for the analysis efforts." And then I usually use the same group process for design. They say, "But we'll only give
Hmm.
you 2 days for design." Because every manager's job is to, hear the request, cut it in half, and give it back to you because that's what
Hmm.
their job is. And so that's what my client's client did to us. And I did a curriculum architecture design. Their team built it out. They won an ATD award 14 months later. And so everybody was really happy. And then they had me come in and do it. And they were more tolerant. My immediate client was more tolerant, but their internal client was not. And so
Mm.
you
Mm.
always have those kinds of issues pushing back. So
Yeah.
um, there's no really, so the amount of time is what it takes. So it depends on the complexity, it depends on the sources that you're going to use.
Hmm.
Too often we're stuck with one subject matter expert. And
Mm.
what the research shows by Dr. Richard E. Clark, Dick Clark, uh, professor emeritus from Southern California University, who's been studying cognitive task analysis. The cognitive tasks, the thinking that behavioral tasks we can see, we can measure, we can count them. Thinking tasks, we cannot do that. We can ask people, what are you thinking about when you're doing that? And their egos will demand that they give us an answer, but it's usually wrong. And therefore, the real trick of analysis is we have to be able to get to cognitively, what are you thinking about? And
Mm.
if we interview 5 different expert performers, they have automated a different set. So the research says people have automated 70% of what they know how to do. You could hold a gun
Hmm.
to their head, they can't tell you. They can't. They've
Yeah.
automated. It's very deep. And so we need to talk to more people. So one of the ways I've avoided analysis paralysis is that I don't try to get that analysis data in my analysis phase. I get it in my development phase when I know for sure I'm working on this block of content and I got to know what are you doing? What are you thinking about while you're
Ah.
doing things? And I defer it till then because that's just in time. Too often I've had, an analysis done and a design for, modules A, B, C, D, and then the clients in the review say, well, we like A and B, but we don't want C and D. Good thing I didn't boil the ocean to get every last
Mm.
data point for C and D when it was going to be cut from the program. So that was another reason to just defer things to when you need it. Because if we pile all that up front, and if we're not really sure of the data that we need, we'll end up demonstrating analysis paralysis. And
Hmm.
I've been struggling with that with clients since forever because they've all experienced that. Our
Hmm.
predecessors have done that to us.
Okay,
I don't
thank
do
you.
short answers. Did anybody pick up on that? Sorry.
Thank you very much, Guy. That makes sense. I
You're
like that
welcome.
you postpone it. Thank you.
Christy.
Hi, Guy. My name's
Hi.
Christy. Thanks so much for coming today. Hopefully, this is a quick answer, but maybe there's no such thing. Um, so it sounds like you're good at building trust with your clients, if you're sort of extracting this information out of them. Um, and you mentioned negotiating differences. I wondered if there's ever a time, like right at the beginning, where you're working with your stakeholders, your expert, your managers, is there ever, a disagreement on what a worthy accomplishment is so that, it's hard to even get to that analysis phase?
Um, yes, in fact, that's why I prefer dealing with master performers because while they may call things differently, on the West Coast they call it this, on the East Coast they call it that. It's the same thing, but they've got different language in different parts of the organization for things.
Mm.
But it's if you're focused on, people are doing things, but what are they producing? And so if you really looked at that, that can kind of clear the decks of all these things because people sometimes think the skill is important or the competency or
Right.
the knowledge is important, and when it's really that's a means to the ends of task performance, which is really a means to the ends of the outputs that's produced the accomplishment. So so it helps to begin with the end in mind and you've got to listen to people talk about this task and that task and this task and that task and I'm listening for an output, and then they write the video script and they go, oh, there's an output, a video script. So that's the one of the important outputs. And that when you have a video script, that's an input downstream to what? Well, to shooting the video. Okay, well, AI is doing a lot of that nowadays. But it's helpful to try to focus in on that and get people's agreement that yeah, and then, the earmarks. What's the earmarks of quality? How do you know a good one from a bad one? Um, this is where managers, my stakeholders on a project, may see things differently than the actual master performers who are doing the jobs to a level of mastery. And when those two points of view clash, it's usually the master performers who win
Oh,
because managers can say, well, I'm kind of removed from this. That's two layers down here. And, from my perspective, it's this, but I got to trust these people, especially if I've done the sneaky trick of having my stakeholders hand pick my sources. And so, what do I know if they're telling the truth or not, or lying to me or making things up? You guys picked these people. These are the sources I've used and compiled all this data. And so, we go from there, and they have to generally trust the master performers who are doing the jobs to a level of mastery. Um, and managers have an excuse. They're at arm's length or further away, and so they really don't know. They thought they knew, but then they might discover that they didn't really know.
right. So you're not taking anything at face value either. You're sort of collecting all the little nuggets and hopefully getting your
One of my
closest to the truth.
competencies is distrust.
Right.
know, it's it's
Distrust.
it's until I get it validated by enough people that they go, yeah, we can concede to that.
Mm.
I wouldn't have said it that way, but yeah, now that I understand what that says and means, yeah, I can do that. And then you're still never really sure. Just because you can get a group of master performers to agree on something doesn't make them right.
Mm.
But who else would you ask? And that's what I tell the steering teams either. I said, we're going based on them. We're trying to get people to perform like to the levels that they are. And so that's who we want to use as the mastery model for performance. We want people to perform more like they do. Now, hopefully they're not violating the law or regulations or whatever. Um, and that's for my steering team to look at when they're reviewing the data that I bring back to them at those gate review meetings.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I have a follow-up question to that. So I think this came up a couple of times in the semester as well, in terms of, so you've collected all this data, you've talked to the master performers, uh, you're still maybe missing stuff. How do you put that in the report to say, these are my assumptions, this is what I was given? So what advice do you have around
So that's
that?
for the client who's usually the requester. Sometimes the
Yeah.
requester is just a person sent in to make the request, but isn't the real client. And the stakeholders. So I'm always challenging everyone about it's all about the data, regardless of how we collect the data and present it. It's all about the data's accuracy, completeness, and appropriateness. And completeness is the most difficult thing because my bias is it's always incomplete. And as I do go into design, I'll add to the analysis data. And as I go into development, I'll add to the analysis data. And when I go pilot test the content to see, how does it work? Do people learn? Is it appropriate, et cetera, et cetera? I'm gathering more and more data. So until I'm done, and then I'm sure that, well, we're missing things. But I got to believe that they are the least important things that people need to know or be able to do. And informal learning, post-formal learning will help pick that up. But if we're but so if the pilot test is truly kind of an acid test, the full destructive test, where people can demonstrate they can perform, and that's usually best done out on the job in the real world. Can they perform out there? If they can't, if our evaluation post deployment looks at that and we can begin to uncover, well, what's missing? And then we can backfill that. So most of the time, I believe that I get the really critical things, and the things that might be missing are things that are more easily picked up and don't do damage to the process or to the output, but are part of the learning curve that people experience when they go back out on the job and apply what they've learned. And they go, oh, I see, I need to do that a little bit differently because maybe their performance context has variances that we didn't understand. Because not everybody's job environment is exactly the same as everybody else who might go through our training.
All this data, do you share this data with the client?
Oh,
And
yeah.
so my question is, how do you sort of protect yourself to say, yeah, this is what I'm basing my strategy on?
Well, basically, it's the old garbage in, garbage out, good stuff in, good stuff out. And so if they gave me the
Right.
right people that could provide me with the data, that's all I'm doing. I'm just a facilitator. I'm gathering
Right.
it, and then I put it all in a report, and then I go to a review meeting and walk them through the key parts of the report. Now, everybody hates the report because it's too damn thick. Back in the day. And it's too many slides in today's, ways of doing Zoom meetings and all of that stuff. Um, but but if this is really if we're working on something that's really critical to the stakeholders, the manager 2 levels up whose bonuses are impacted by the current state performance, and if we improve that, their bonus theoretically or their careers survive or whatever, usually I've got their attention when I can bring it back to, a business orientation. This isn't about learning. Learning is a means of the ends of performance. That's the business. That's what we're in business to do. So when I take a business perspective, if I bookend my learning and development professionalism with a business professionalism, then I get more respect from the clients. And I can talk to them about where I think I might be missing, where I question the data, and I need them to scrutinize it or have them pick people to scrutinize the data before we go forward. That's
Okay.
sometimes how I have to handle that. But in truth, when you're doing an analysis or even a design, if you're doing these really adequately, there's a lot there. And people are busy
Mhm.
and they don't have time to look at these things. And so that's the real challenge, is to get the adequate reviews done before you move forward with that data into the next block in your Addy-like approach to things.
Awesome. Yeah, that's good. Thank you. Annie had her hand up.
Yeah, I was wondering if you have a particularly memorable experience or anecdote of when a client came up to you with a training and learning problem, and then you were able to find a root cause that was actually quite different. I love hearing those kinds of stories.
Yeah. So back in the 90s, I had a client who had budgeted $700,000 for the development of training for a critical target audience in their business. And they had heard about me from their network of people. So it was in the Chicagoland area where I used to live. And I showed them the analysis data. I read it out and I'm reading out, here's the outputs and blah, blah, blah. Here's the typical performance gaps. Here's the causes. Here's the DKs. There's a few of those. Most of these are DEs, deficiency in the environment, deficiency in the environment, page after page after page of deficiency of environment. I got to the end of that and they said, and they were all talking amongst each other, and we were in a physical room together, and they were all whispering to each other, and I knew what they were whispering about. And they said, Guy, could you go down to the cafeteria and get some coffee while we discuss this? And I go, yes, I think you probably need to discuss the fact that you told me we were doing this uh, training to fix the performance problems that you have. And the data that I've shown you has shown to you that knowledge and skills aren't the deficit. Training isn't going to fix your problems, and you probably need to talk about that. And so I went down to the cafeteria. 45 minutes later, they came and retrieved me and brought me back into the meeting. And they said, I forget how they kicked it off, but I said something like, "Well, I'm expecting that you're going to need to cancel this project halfway. We've done the analysis, but we're not going to do the design and the development." And they
Mhm.
said, "No, actually, we want you to do both, but we want you to defer doing the design until we send in CAT teams, critical action teams, to fix some of these environmental deficiencies that you've uncovered for us." But we're going to triple this operation in size, and we've got hundreds of people coming in that are going to need the training regardless. And you've shown us what they need to be able to do. And we've heard you about navigating the barriers and the gaps and blah, blah, blah. But we need to fix those things before you design
Right.
and develop this. Well, as a consultant, had been in business for, 15 years at that point, I thought, yeah, right. You'll call me someday, right? I'll hear about that. But they did. And so we picked up the project, I don't know, 4 or 5 months later, and they had fixed things. So we had to revisit the analysis data to decide what they'd already fixed, and then use that to go into a design mode. Again, I was using master performers and other subject matter experts in the analysis effort, and then I used that same group, some of which who had been involved in the critical action teams,
Yeah.
do the design, and then I hired in a bunch of subcontractors and my staff to do the development work.
Mm. And so when the CAT teams went and fixed all the environmental problems, was there an actual knowledge gap after? So
Yes, because
when the
sometimes
environment was right, yeah, even that.
sometimes we got rid of that piece of equipment and got in something new. You had to operate
Ah,
differently, and how? There you go. So
okay.
yeah, so you make changes. Now I've had clients who said we're going to do the training now because we haven't got time to wait on that, and we're going to make fixes in parallel. And I would say, but then you're going to have to do a lot of revisiting of your
Right.
content and refresh it, update it. And they go, yeah, that's the least cost we got to worry about, because what the stakes were on the performance side were so significant that we could spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on training and fixing the training, quarter after quarter after quarter, and that it was nothing compared to what was at stake, the real financials. So one of the things that all learning and development professionals need to do is understand how score is kept in a business. What are the finances? How do you calculate ROI or cost benefit analysis or whatever it's called in your enterprise? You need to understand how to make the financial business case when you're doing, people need this learning. Yeah,
Right.
why? What's if we don't, so what? What's the damage done? Can you dollarize that? Um, and so those are the things that we need to be able to demonstrate to our clients, that we have some business savvy. We're not just learning professionals. We understand business. We understand that sometimes you leave things to informal learning because it's just not worth building and deploying content on every last thing, which those of us who love learning sometimes are wont to do.
Yeah. Thank you. That was a great answer. Thank you so much.
Guy, it's 12 noon here. Um, do you have time for one more question?
I have time for all the questions that you have.
Okay.
Let's
Does
exhaust the
anybody
group.
does anybody have a question? Sam, go ahead.
Hi, Guy. I'm Sam. Thanks for joining us. I have a question about um, measurement. So, how would you measure um, in an intervention, like how effective it is when there could be like multiple performance factors? And why I was thinking about this question is in our class we were working on imaginary case studies. And for mine, I had a few small interventions I wanted to put into place. And I don't know how to measure how effective each intervention is if I implement them all at once.
Yeah, that so first of all, we need to have um, pre-intervention data about, so if we're training people, having them learn things, it's because they're going to apply that in some process. So what's the current state process metrics? How is quality, quantity, and cost measured? So what's the case before we start? Then if we do these interventions all at once, we're not going to be able to necessarily tease them out as to which one contributed most to improvements in quality, quantity, and costs. Unless the client is willing to, and sometimes, that's too nitty gritty. We're just trying to generally get a ballpark to say, if we spend $100,000 on this, we're going to get $300,000 improvement in performance at the end. So that's a net $200,000 gain the first year. The second year, it's a $300,000 gain, et cetera, however far you need to go out. But the only way to test out the contribution of one intervention versus another is to deploy them separately in a bunch of different, staged implementations, if you will. So we put the first intervention in and we can measure, so what did that do? And then we put the second intervention in and say, well, what additional improvements did we get based on that one? And then if you're really going to be crazy, if you're going to do a three, you're going to have to do 9 different styles where, A goes first and then the next time B goes first. And so I don't think there's a real easy answer to that. And most clients are not going to tolerate any of that. They just want to get it fixed so they can go on to the next issue that they need to manage. So I'm not sure that I have a good answer for that. I've done things where, in the last example that I gave, where critical action teams went in and made various fixes, and then we did the training thing, and my clients were able to measure performance using their existing business metrics, the stuff that they already tracked pre-interventions and post interventions, to see, these new people that were coming on board, how was their performance compared to the old group, the original group before we did any training for them. So measurement, I don't think is, we can be precise, but nobody wants to jump through all the hoops, some of which are on fire, to get that done, to get that granular. There will be cases in somebody's lives where that's important to really know, but I think most of the time it's not. So I'm not sure that you can get a good answer to that. Sorry.
Oh, thank you. No, it's still useful. Thank you very much for answering the question.
It confirms our direction, right, Sam?
Yes.
We're just looking at it as a whole. That's beautiful. So, I have one final question, if I may, and a comment. So I'll start with the question. So for graduate students entering the world of HPT, what mindset shifts are the most important early in their careers?
So I think going back to having some business acumen is really critical. Understanding what the finances of a business are like, what's an income statement, what's the cash flow analysis, how to really gauge that, because shareholders, owners of a company are putting their money into this and they expect a decent return. So if we want to mess around and make improvements at a cost, what's the financial benefit? So we're not pushing things that have a nil or negative return on investment. Um, and so there and so that's one of the mind shifts is that, it's not all about learning. It's really all about performance. And learning is a means to impact performance. And so that's what our role is. But there's other players in the sandbox of performance improvement, people from the quality organization, business process re-engineering, OD functions. So not so you need to understand the enterprise that you're working in or for and understand who are some of these other player functions and organizations or people that bring certain expertise to bear, and you need to collaborate with them. Learning and development is not always going to be in the driver's seat. It's usually going to be somebody else. If HPT efforts from an instructional systems designer, learning and development perspective uncovers all these other issues that aren't about knowledge and skills, we may not be the person to take the lead on resolving all those other issues. And we may be a player on that team, but we probably won't be a leader on that team, depending on, clients and how much they love us and respect us and trust us and all that stuff. Sometimes they may want us to do it because they don't trust any of the other people. So, and then that becomes your headache that the client doesn't trust the other people that you have to collaborate with. And so that's just tricky business. Um, but I think you need to, master learning and development. You need to master this perspective of there are more variables to performance than knowledge and skills. There are many models out there. You need to learn them, but you have to understand what business is all about. And there are uh, people in our field like well, there's people associated with ISPI that kind of focus on that and bring that perspective to others. Those of us who may not have, MBA type of a background, but understanding that part about business, appreciating that, and that sometimes your best solution isn't financially viable. It's just not for a multitude of reasons, but and appreciating that you can bring that to your client. You can tell them this may or may not be financially viable. That's for you guys to decide. You make that business decision to make this investment to implement what I'm suggesting. Um, and you need to understand the Pareto principle that perhaps 20% of the solution set bring you 80% of the results, and so there's no sense pushing everything into place. You may need a smaller subset of that that'll have the greatest impact.
Fantastic. What keeps you going? I know that you're 3 years into retirement and you're still here with us. You're still oozing passion for this work. I'm grateful that you said yes to my invitation, and I hope that for all of us, because there's enough of what we're providing to support performance everywhere, starting with our own performance in our lives, our families, and then of course in organizations. Any final comments or inspiration?
Well, so to answer your question about what keeps me going is that back in 1999, I was publishing my first book that I wrote solo, my second book, and it was Lean ISD. And I had emailed or called Gary Rumler and said, look, I've attributed all of my approach to analysis to the derivative of a derivative of yours that I learned back in 1979. If you don't like what I wrote, I'll take it out. And he said, come down and see me. So I spent 2 days with him in his offices. And at one point I asked him, how in the heck am I ever going to be able to repay you? Well, he was writing at a whiteboard at the time. And I said that and he wrote, he stopped, he looked at me and he said, you can't. And then he started writing again. He's a jokester. And I said, well, I'm sitting there thinking, what? And he said, and he stopped writing. And he turned to me and he said, you're going to have to do what I had to do. I couldn't pay back my mentors either. All you can do is pay it forward. And so NSPI and ISPI, my professional home, that's what everybody did. And so that just resonated with me. And I'd already been doing some of that sharing and writing and presenting at conferences and such, but that just fueled my fire for needed to express my thankfulness to him and to my many other mentors by sharing not only what I learned from them, but what I did with it, how I adopted it or adapted it for my purposes and share that further and freely share that, which is part of the reason why I'm giving all my books away. Um, because I really believe that in what I learned from those people, most of the great thought leaders of ISPI back in the day were willfully sharing everything they knew. They weren't
Very true.
they weren't fearful of, creating their own competition.
Yep. That has been my experience with ISPI as well. I'm hoping for a group photo. If you would like to be in the group photo, fix your hair or come on camera. If not, you could certainly keep your camera off. Is everyone ready? There we go. Ben's going to fix his hair. All right. 1, 2, 3. Oh, we look good. Thank you so much, Guy, again for making time. See you again on Thursday.
Thank you for
And
inviting me, and I hope everybody has a wonderful, productive career.
yes, thank you.
Well, welcome everyone, and thank you, Sonia, for inviting me to come and speak to your class. This is about human performance technology from an L&D practitioner's perspective. I'm going to talk about this mostly as it impacts the analysis phase. This is my adapted ADDIE model, if you will. I adapted this back in 1982. There's no need to take copious notes. This is going to be made available. I've already made the PDF and a PowerPoint show of this slide deck available through Sonia, and she can distribute this whenever that's appropriate. So the agenda is I'm going to do a quick overview of me, who am I to be speaking about this? And then I'm going to share my mental models or frameworks for ISD and for HPT. I've branded both of these because I've been a consultant since 1982. And then we'll have some time for questions and answers afterwards. I started in 1979. I have a radio, TV, film degree from the University of Kansas, and I had been working for Wix Lumber in Lawrence, Kansas, and they invited me to come to their headquarters in Saginaw, Michigan, and join the 10-person training services group back in August of 79. And I went to work with two people who were there 2 weeks earlier than me. They had come from Blue Cross Blue Shield in Detroit, where they had worked alongside Gary Rumler's brother, Rick, not to be confused with the son, Rick. And Gary Rumler was a business partner with Tom Gilbert in a consulting organization called Praxis back from the late 60s through the late 70s. And so they were advocates of what Rumler and Gilbert were doing. And these two guys are some of the founders of human performance technology, if you will. So I was immediately inundated into a performance orientation. In fact, one of the things I was told is that we're all about performance. We're not really all about training. That was the language back in the day. And in fact, we intend to deliver job aids to people for reference on the job rather than traditional training. Well, our clients hated that after we did that the first project we all had. And so we did sneaky trick 47, and that was to embed job aids into the training. We made the clients happy, and we made the target audience, the learners, if you will, the performers back out on the job. We made them happy because we gave them guidance for their performance on the job so that they didn't have to impossibly memorize everything that was necessary. In fact, it wasn't necessary because back out on the job, as I well knew because I had worked in one of those job sites, that there was plenty of time to reference what to do, and you didn't have to have it committed to memory most of the time. I spent less than 2 years at Wix Lumber in Saginaw, Michigan, and then I got a job at Motorola at their Motorola's Training and Education Center, and Gary Rumler was my consultant, which meant I carried his pencils around as we went from client site to client site to client site all across North America. Um, But I even got the job because I had his name in my resume, and that caught the attention of the new director of the organization. I've had over 80 clients since 1982. Some of them are the bigger ones where I had multiple projects, a bunch of projects. You can see I've had a couple of clients, General Motors and AT&T, over 25 projects with each of them. I've worked with all of the autos, blah, blah, blah. But anyway, so I've had a lot of experience, and all of this was about instructional systems design, ISD, nowadays known as L&D. So people are on the payroll to not know things or to do things, not to exhibit behaviors, because knowing things and behaving and performing tasks is but a means to the ends of producing worthy outputs, what Gilbert would have called worthy accomplishments. And my definition of performance competence, the goal, and this is what I would share with clients, is the ability to perform tasks to produce outputs that meet stakeholder requirements, where the task performed, the process, the workflow, if you will, is to stakeholder requirements. It meets the regulatory requirements or what other requirements there may be. And it produces outputs of value, either services rendered or widgets produced, etc. But they have to also meet the stakeholder requirements. Well, who are the stakeholders? On the right is an illustrative example that is from an article that I wrote for a quality journal back in the mid 90s. So society is at the top. We're all, working for the betterment of society, theoretically. And there's the government with the regulatory agencies imposing law, and, you've got to meet those things. But customers, if you see that box kind of leans to the right, that kind of pulls the requirements for performance because we must meet the customer's requirements as best we can. But if the customer's requirements require us to break the law, to violate regulations, well, that's no good and they don't win. Customer is not king. That was the subtitle of my article way back in the day. So L&D and performance improvement, the measures of such really center on the processes and workflows and their outputs. And in layman's terms, we're always trying to produce outputs better, faster, and cheaper. Or in the TQM, total quality management movement, they might have called that quality, quantity, and cost. Higher quality, higher quantity at lower costs. I've got several things that I want to bring up about that relate to human performance technology. And one of them is that a request for L&D for new hires should be expected. And a request for L&D for solving a performance problem should be suspected. Now, many of you have probably seen in the online and LinkedIn and elsewhere, not to be an order taker. Well, the late Joe Harless spoke about this at NSPI, which is now ISPI, back in the mid 80s. And he was at one of the conferences and he spoke to the group and he said, when a client comes to you and asks you for a training widget, you shouldn't say in your whiniest voice, "Are you sure it's a training problem?" He thought that was bad form. That was not a good way to start off a relationship with the customer. You accept the request regardless. You take the order. And what's important is that you ensure that in your order fulfillment process, whatever you call it, ADDIE, SAM, whatever, is that it includes an analysis or discovery effort that will help you determine what the desired state is, what the required state is compared to the current state. What are the processes? Are they meeting the requirements? What are the outputs? Are they meeting the requirements? What gaps are there? And what are the causes for those gaps? It's just as important, I was taught back in 1979, for us to avoid training when training isn't going to solve the problem as it is to do training when it's warranted in a stellar manner that really improves performance, addresses the needs of the people in the processes or workflows. Now, I've talked about this a little bit before, but if the performance context, the environment where people are performing, demands a memorized performance response, you got to know it off the top of your head immediately. There's no chance, no time to look anything up. Then you would produce a learning experience, a performance-based learning experience with plenty of practice with feedback to really hone that performance response. But if the performance context allows a reference performance response, well, then you would develop performance guidance, what Rumler and Gilbert called guidance, what later became more popularly known as job aids. And nowadays it's either electronic performance support systems or it's performance support, a whole bunch of names. It's just pretty much like having standard operating procedures, SOPs, that guide the performer in the performance of the tasks to produce the outputs along the way. Now, when the stakes are high, when the risks and rewards of performance are high, you might even want to provide a performance guidance with inside a learning experience so that people can practice and get feedback on using that performance guidance, those job aids, that performance support, and hone their ability to do so. You just don't send them a performance guide and just let it go at that. You might if the stakes are low or medium, but when the stakes are high, you probably do both. So memorized performances responses are one thing, but reference performance responses are another. In my 40 plus years, I would say the vast majority, probably over 80% of the performance that I analyzed and built instruction for, either performance guides or learning experiences, performance guides would have been sufficient. Now, some of that was high risk, high reward performance, and so therefore it was often embedded into a learning experience or training program, as we used to call it back in the day. The stakeholders, I kind of talked about this a little bit. So stakeholders establish the measures for your learning program's impact. When you're looking at did it transfer, well, how would you know? You look at that and you say, did we then have an impact? Did we help the process and the outputs produced be done better, faster, cheaper, higher quality, higher quantity, at lower cost? Now, organizations nowadays, most of the time, not always, have KPIs, key process indicators for their processes and their outputs. But one of the things that I learned long ago, back in the 80s, was that many times the master performers that I would work with as subject matter experts, they would complain that those KPIs were built by committee. They didn't represent the real world. They were politically correct, but they weren't really useful. They weren't valid. And master performers who had achieved mastery of performance as recognized by my clients and handpicked to work with me on my projects, these master performers knew how performance was assessed in the real world by their customers, by their bosses, by the government regulators, by everyone involved. And so I tended to politically accept the KPIs that I was handed and said that I would dutifully use them, but then I would use what the master performers told me and then have to explain that to my clients whenever we had our gate review meetings. Now, I branded my approach to HPT as EPI, Enterprise Process Performance Improvement, and there are many different models of this. Carl Binder's got some that are, he comes from the Gilbert School of Thought, and I come from the Rumler School of Thought, and so there's a lot of overlap between this. But on the far left there, inputs feed the process, which then produces the outputs. And those outputs are inputs downstream. So you can just take that little three little boxes there and repeat them endlessly until it escapes the enterprise and goes to some customer organization. But there are human enablers that enable the process, and there are environmental enablers. And this is simply my model, how I would assess what are the enablers, if there are gaps in the outputs produced and there's gaps in the process, you know, what's it attributed back to? And so that's my model. You'll be able to look at that later on. Once you find what the gaps are, you know, there's somebody in the organization responsible for those gaps. They're the guilty parties. So you need to kind of swim upstream and look at the inputs that are being provided. Is it the data and information systems? Well, who owns that? It's not always just the IT organization. Or the materials and supplies or tools and equipment that are provided provision to the processes. Who's responsible for that? And maybe they need to do their own diagnostics and fix whatever's ailing them so that their gaps in the process I'm focused on aren't are no longer there. They've been mitigated. So this is again just a model that I use. It's a mental model that I use because I've got to go find out, well, who organized this job and who redesigns the job if the job is clunky and getting in the way and it's not clear who's supposed to do what in the process and people are tripping all over themselves. Maybe that needs to be re-looked at. And so who's responsible for that? Is it the client? Is it some OD organization in HR or where? Again, this is my adapted ADDIE model. You'll see that it's got the analysis, design, and development part of it. But then I've extracted pilot test from the development phase because I always wanted to make a big deal about that and pilot test it and do a full destructive test. I would always use two audiences in my pilot test. I would have the target audience because I needed to see can we have learning occur? If I do a pre-test and then a post-test, can I figure out whether or not they know more than when they walked in the door, so to speak? But then they can tell me they can help me measure learning, but they can't tell me whether that learning was accurate, complete, and appropriate. So the second group I always involved in my pilot test were master performers, other people who hadn't been involved in my project, and they could tell me whether the content and what we were teaching people was accurate, complete, and appropriate. Now, just because you can get master performers, a group of master performers, and other subject matter experts to agree that something is accurate, complete, and appropriate doesn't make them right. But who else would you ask? So you start there and then you build what you're going to build and you deploy it and you measure it and you see if you're having the impact. And you might find that everybody missed something. But if you're an instructional designer type like I am, you wouldn't know what that performance is. You're working with others to craft the intervention, the instructional intervention. And so you need that kind of support. Well, I do also curriculum architecture design. That's kind of what I made my reputation on starting back in the 80s. And this is the architecture of content, the configuration of content, so people can get what they need, skip what they don't need, because just because somebody's got the same job title doesn't mean that their job is exactly the same as everybody else. There's always that variance. And there are people who come into the job and what they already know, their prior knowledge, there's variances in that too, from their prior education and experiences. So you need to understand all those variances in order to basically configure the content so people can get what they need when they need it and skip what they don't need because they already know it or it's not part of their job. In both the instructional architecture and instructional development methods, where we produce performance guides and or learning experience, I always do 4 types of analysis. And this, I try to pose this to my clients without them worrying about analysis paralysis because every last client does. So I do a target audience analysis, how many people are they, where are they coming from, what are those variances? I can't ask or determine what do they already know until I've done the next 2. What performance analysis? What are the outputs produced? What are the tasks performed? Who's doing what? And what are the gaps? I need to understand that performance analysis. Then I can systematically derive the knowledge and skills that enable that performance. Then I can finish my target audience analysis and figure out when they walk in the door, the new hires, what do they already know that's needed? What performance do they already know? What knowledge and skills do they already have? So I can get a better sense of that and then appropriately configure the content to fill in the gaps and help people master the jobs. I also tell my clients that I need to look at all the existing content, all the existing training, education, communications, brochures, whatever they've got, so that we can reassess it for its reuse potential. Reuse it as is, reuse it after modification, or reject it because it just doesn't fit. And they always like that because we're salvaging prior investments of shareholder equity and we're not just ignoring it. We're going to reuse it if it's appropriate, or we're going to fix it if it's fixable. And sometimes we just need to reject it. This kind of strings all that stuff together, but the important part is that ideal outputs and the process tasks, and then the current state gaps from stakeholder requirements, that drives the knowledge and skill requirements. So I always want to do performance analysis and then understand the gaps, because when I'm working with people and they see that, okay, yeah, that's what we want, those outputs, those tasks, and yes, here are the current state gaps in the real world today, that will help them think about knowledge and skills that are required a little bit differently. You can review these questions later. These are the questions that I use when I do training of people, and I've trained people at Eli Lilly and Amoco and General Motors and a bunch of other places, AT&T. These are the questions that I teach people to use. Only I tell them, these are my questions. You can't use them. Figure out your own questions. Create alternatives to these. And then when you get out in the real world, you can use mine and yours, but you've always got to be able to ask questions one or two ways, because sometimes guys' questions don't resonate with who you're asking. And so that's no good. And so you have to have a different way to ask the same questions. And so that was part of my madness and my methods for training other people. But this gets you to the ideal performance. The next chart here is, so how do you then determine what the gaps are? So these are the questions I use. And then gap causes are either there's a deficiency in the process itself or in the environmental supports, or there's a deficiency of people's knowledge and skills, or it's some other individual attribute or value. And then this third chart is the questions that I use to systematically derive the enabling knowledge and skills. I capture the performance on this kind of a chart. I've been using this chart since 1979, or a variation of this. It's very similar to what this chart looks like. I use a facilitated group process where I ask my clients to, instead of taking 3 weeks or 3 months to do the analysis, why don't we get it done in 3 days and bring in people to a facilitated group process, a meeting where I'm going to process them through the data gathering, and then on a double wide flip chart, it looks like this. It gets messy, et cetera, et cetera. But so this is kind of what it looks like, and then it gets a word process or typed up to look exactly as it was given to me. Because if I'm working with master performers in my analysis process, I intend to then do design concurrently with a review team, the design team of these master performers, a subset of them usually, and this is what this begins to look like. So this is a piece of work from 1986. So we want to know, what's the output that's produced? What are the key measures for that? How do you know a good one from a bad one? What are the tasks that are performed? What are the typical deficiencies, not the atypical deficiencies, something that happens every 47 years, but typically, do we have problems with this? And that's when the outputs don't meet the measures. So is there a typical deficiency? Yes or no? There isn't always one, but sometimes there is. And then what are some of the probable deficiency causes? So some of those are labeled here as DK and DE. Training is not going to fix the DEs. It's not going to fix the barriers out there in the environment, the shortfalls, the gaps in the environmental supports that are needed. But that may be useful to teach the new people that these barriers exist. Now, master performers always have strategies and tactics on how they avoid the barriers in the first place and what to do in the second place if the barriers were unavoidable. How do they recover effectively and efficiently? And so sometimes that's what you've got to teach new people, how to deal with the barriers, and if they were unsuccessful in avoiding them, what to do next. So the gaps and the causes, this triggers different kind of thinking when I'm working with a group of people, or when I'm doing this through individual interviews, in terms of what do people need to know. And those strategies and tactics are the things that I'm usually going for at that point. And that's all part of the cognitive task. It's not the behavioral task. You can't see, measure, and look at people when they're doing those things, but it's how they think about the work that they do. What do they think about before, during, and after the behavioral tasks that we can see? what are those cognitive tasks? If we don't have that included in our instruction, people are going to struggle, and they're going to go from that 10% formal into the 20% social and the 70% trial and error learning that they have to do because it wasn't included in their original instruction. Now, my model here is about the L&D pivot point, and the upside down traffic lights, the stop lights, if you will, well, they're go lights because the green is at the top. And what I'm doing there is I'm reviewing with my client and hopefully key stakeholders. I'm reviewing the project plan with them, and then we're kicking it off. I'm reviewing the analysis data or the design or the results of a pilot test. I'm taking my clients along on the journey this way. They, in the first box, project planning and kickoff, in the kickoff meeting, I asked them, here's the project plan. Your first order of business is to do one of four things. Kill this project because it doesn't make any business sense. My clients always hated when I led with that, but that's how I do this because I want this to be about business, not about learning. This is about learning as a means to the ends of improved business performance. So if the project makes sense, then I want them to buy into it. If it doesn't, I want them to kill it. Or they might say, this is not timely, we need to defer this, or we need to modify the approach of the project because that's just not feasible for some reason that I didn't know, and this is our project together, not mine alone. Or they need to accept the project plan and resource it, and this is where I can trap them into giving me the right people to do the right things at the right time. I don't ever ask for subject matter experts or master performers, and I'm not out there begging for them. I've gotten the steering team for the project, who are typically the bosses or the bosses' bosses of the target audience, and they can make that happen. They can make sure that other master performers that they have deemed are needed for this project to show up for working with me, whether that's a 3-day analysis meeting or a 3-day design meeting, or if it's a bunch of individual interviews and observations and document reviews. They can make that happen. I don't beg for those kinds of things. I don't have to scramble for those kinds of things. If this project is worthy, they get it for me. So then I do my analysis work and bring back the 4 types of analysis data that I shared with you before. So when I get a request, part of that project planning is the intake process of the request. So I always take the project and I wait until after the analysis phase is done for the clients to decide whether or not we should continue with an instructional development effort or we should pivot to some non-instructional efforts because there's DEs and there's other things that need to be fixed and we don't have DKs, deficiencies of knowledge, or we do both. We build the instruction for the target audiences and we go fix the other issues that were addressed. So, and I also would tell them at the end of the analysis phase that a lot of this doesn't require people to memorize these things. They can be given guidance for use on the job. And that's more reliable than people's faulty memories. And sometimes, of course, that requires a debate about all of that with the clients who have a mindset about those kinds of things. And so part of my job is to educate them on things of that nature. And they can see that we've reflected what the stakeholder requirements are in our analysis data, and that we intend to build instruction that'll help people perform and meet those stakeholder requirements. I see that in whatever I was sent by Sonia, that this book was on your suggested reading. It wasn't required. But I've wrote chapter 11 there on modeling mastery performance and systematically deriving the enablers for performance improvement. A long, clunky title, yes. But this reflects, it's a 25-page PDF. You can get it for free off of one of my websites if you're so interested. But this reflects what made my practice in instructional systems design successful and led to me doing 25 different projects for companies like General Motors. On my website, I have these 4 books that have been available as free PDFs since 2007. just a couple of weeks ago, I added 26 additional books. Yeah, I've been writing a lot of books when I'm not busy with consulting. I did retire in 2023, but I wrote most of these books before that. The Quality Roadmap was my first book. It was a combination of total quality management and human performance technology. This is what myself and my business partners, this is how we did our work with our clients. And so we had a consortium ask us to write a book about that because we had done work with them. And so we wrote this book with a ghostwriter. Then in 2022 and 2023, I wrote a couple additional books. The two on the left are available as free PDFs. The book on the right is not. It was written in conjunction with LDA, the Learning Development Accelerator professional organization. I've also got a Spotify podcast. If you're interested in that, there's 80 some things there. And so now it's time for me to stop sharing and for Q&A. What questions might you have for me? Stunned silence. Oh, maybe not.
I could I could get us started. Hi, Guy. Nice to meet you. I'm Julia.
Hi, Julie.
This might not it might be a question more for the enterprise rather than the consultant, but I like what you said about L&D for new staff hires is the way to go, obviously, and I completely agree. How can you get an enterprise or a team organization to prioritize L&D when new staff have to quote unquote hit the ground running? Um, and how do you manage that?
Well, so my experience as an external consultant is different than people who are inside doing this kind of work.
Sure.
But it is a challenge because yeah, people want. So I think you have to appeal to clients about, I don't love learning for the sake of learning. I love learning for the sake of performance improvement. So if you want to hire people in and on day one, put them in there, what's at risk? What are the rewards at stake? And therefore, I don't believe in, piling on a lot of learning onto people up front when it's not necessary. But what are the things that people need to know how to do on day one? Otherwise, uh, it gets bad. And when I'm appealing to clients and stakeholders, I'm usually trying to appeal to their own self-interest. The boss's boss or anybody in that chain, well, their bonuses generally depend on what's happening down there at the worker level. And their career can be enhanced or end because of what's happening down at the worker level. So they need to be kind of judicious in focusing. These are the areas of performance where we need to make sure that people are prepared to do the work. Now, can they learn it on the job? Of course, that's the best place to learn it. Now, who's going to do that? Who's going to teach them that? The supervisor, are they good teachers? Do they really know what they're talking about? A supervisor rises to the top and they maybe have three different job titles under there and they only held one of them. So the other two, they really don't know what that person's job is. So the issue is scalability of, one-on-one coaching on the job training. And so this is a challenge, but, so what's at risk and what are the rewards at stake? And
Yeah.
we need to be working with them and have them pick where we work, what we work on, and do their bidding. And when budgets get cut, if we're working on what they wanted to have done, we're less likely to get cut when budgets get cut. Not always, but the only safeguard we can have is to make sure that we're working on what Rumler called the CBIs, the critical business issues.
Mm.
It's not easy, but it's a partnership, and you certainly have to build trust with your clients and not be pushing learning for the sake of learning because they hate that.
Yeah.
I've been told.
Thanks. And I think there's a misunderstanding of what learning on the job means. Like just because you're because a lot of times I see learning on the job means that people are just trying and failing and trying and failing and making a lot and wasting time instead of actually learning on the job does require some teaching or coaching.
Yeah, so there's formal learning on the job and there's informal learning on the job and trial and error. So if guy screws up and messes up and has to do it 27 times, is that a big deal? Well, if you lose your key client, yeah. Or if you violate the regulatory requirements, yeah. So, we need to be driven by the current state gaps, and we need to begin to address those things. And we need to decide, how formal do we mean when we say formal learning? I mean, can a peer teach Guy how to do that part of the job? Can we trust that? Can it be a supervisor or somebody from another function? Or is it somebody from the learning and development organization who either builds some, face-to-face, person-to-person training, or is an e-learning module going to be sufficient? And even if the e-learning module is sufficient, does that provide the practice with feedback? Can it give me reinforcing feedback that I did steps 1, 2, 3 correctly, but step 4 I didn't, and here's a better way to do that. Now let's do it all over again. So I need reinforcing feedback and corrective feedback in authentic practice, which is best out on the job. But again, it's not scalable. So we, generally pull people back and have them learn in some learning environment rather than in the job environment.
I do have a question. So I was wondering how the age of AI is impacting your practice in terms of instructional design and performance consulting.
Well, I retired in 2023,
Yeah,
so I am
Lucky.
not. Yeah, so I think that AI has great promise. In fact, I just got an email before we started here with Dr. Richard E. Clark, Professor Emeritus from the University of Southern California. He's been working on cognitive task analysis via AI. He's been working on this for 15 years. And he just asked me if I knew of any companies where they could trial out what they've now built. So I do believe AI is a very powerful tool, but back in the late 70s, we knew GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. So if your AI tool doesn't understand your specific work processes and the regulatory requirements and the make and model of the machinery or whatever's in the process, if it doesn't understand that, it can't do a very good job. And if it's not fed with the proper information, then it can make guesses and it can hallucinate a whole bunch of stuff, which it can do even if it's fed the right stuff. So, but I think all of that will improve. So you need to not trust it. You need to verify what comes out of AI. But I think it's a very powerful tool. But I don't think it's reached the point where you can trust it. But the Rumler and Gilbert I talked about earlier, they had a 1970 newsletter article that I was given on day one when I got out of college, and it was about guidance. And imagine a worker having a tape recorder strapped to their belt, telling them exactly what to do. People have been dreaming about this forever, and now it's here where you can get guidance step by step, how to think about what you're doing as well in a tool. And so all of this, the promise of all the things that we always wanted, having short modules or long modules, whatever is needed, have spaced learning, whatever is needed, this is much easier with the technology of today. So I've always been a tool agnostic. I don't care what the current state of tools are, because I shouldn't fall in love with them, because what's going to happen next year? They're going to be different. And so you should not get enamored with a particular tool, but you should use the tools that are available to you. And when we look at our clients and the target audience and their work processes, their workflows, what tools are already there? We should try to help people use what they already have, because it's not likely that we're going to cause the enterprise to invest in a whole new tool set. That's just problematic. So we need to figure out what do we have and how do we best use those things. But we need to stay on the leading edge of learning about these tools and what they can do for us as they exist right now. And that's a difficult job. And I don't envy any of you guys, you younger people. I'm 73, so I'm not going to worry about it too much, but I do use it. But I'm not a master of it. I'm not trying to be. But good luck to you all in that.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Mai.
Hi, Guy. I hope you getting better with the surgery. because
Oh, thank
I
you.
have
I
been
don't know if you can
yes,
see my neck here. I had surgery
yeah.
16 days ago, and
So I was a little bit worried because I saw your post. I have been following your LinkedIn, but haven't like connected yet because I haven't officially met you in person or online. So I have a question about competency framework because you're an
yes.
expert in the field, and I have experience working as a consultant in Vietnam. I'm from Vietnam, by the way. And a lot of enterprises, they ask us to develop a competency framework for the leadership development. And the reality turned out that after we spent like almost half of the year or 8 months to develop a competency framework for them, but after that, is it really effective? Not really. So for me, it's more like a myth that like enterprises keep asking about the standard framework for them to measure the performance. But in the end, it's not that like practical or used effectively. So what's your take on that and what's your suggestion to make it more like effective?
Well, so this has been an age-old issue. So competencies came around when the Hay organization, which used to help organizations establish management salaries, which back in the day were based on what's the body count, how many people are you managing? You're managing 100, okay, we're going to pay you a certain amount. You're managing 300, okay, so you get more money. Well, when IT came along, that changed everything because the department of five people had significantly more impact than a person managing 300. So the Hay organization came up with competencies. Now, competencies are generic. That's the problem. It's like generic behaviors when behaviors are really situational. Should you be the good cop or the bad cop? Should how do you deal with the situation? It varies, and so we've treated competencies not as they exist in performance, but with a general approach, an educational approach, if you versus a training approach. Um, and so I've been dealing with that because I've had clients who wanted uh, to develop competency models, and everybody's got a competency inventory. This goes back into the 80s, and it's just not been effective because it's basically a bunch of education on various competencies, but then bridging the gap from what I learned to how to apply it was missing. It was never covered. So the idea is you can take a competency list and go, okay, for this job title, how does that one competency manifest itself in that job environment? Or this other job, is it the same or different? So what's been missing is the application of the awareness, knowledge, and skills of the competency out into the real world work. So one of the books that I showed that I've made available for free back in 2007 is Management Areas of Performance. This is how Guy Wallace and his team, I used to have consultants, 15 to 25 people in my staff, um, do this kind of work and do management curricula. I did one for NASA after the Challenger accident in 87. And the model that we use is that there are certain things that are unique to a department and what a manager's job is. If you're in the sales organization versus the finance organization, well, some things are the same. Budgeting is the same. Strategic planning is the same in those two departments. But the sales processes are different than the finance processes. And there's the differences. And so there are some things that are general that we can share with people, how to do strategic planning in this company. We have these forms to fill out and we have this process, blah, blah, blah. Or you do the annual budget or you submit a expense report form. Those are all the same because they're under control. But the things that are unique are the core processes of a department. And so a manager's competencies have to reflect their department's processes. Nowadays, we call processes workflows, so don't mean to confuse anybody. But so we need to look at the workflow. We need to understand that workflow and the specifics of it. And what are the competencies? Well, in my world, they're performance competencies, the ability to perform tasks to to produce outputs that meet stakeholder requirements. Those stakeholders could be the finance department. They want you to do the budgeting a certain way. They're one of the stakeholders. The regulators might say the law requires when you're doing budgeting to do it a certain way. And so there's all these stakeholders. We need to make sure that we are preparing people to survive out there in their workflows by meeting all those stakeholder requirements. So we can take generic lists of competencies and we can look at them one at a time to how they play out specifically in different workflows. Now, that kind of defeats the whole purpose of having a mastery list, and it's just so easy. And we've been looking for the silver bullet for so long, and our clients, the managers, they're never going to stop looking for that silver bullet. They're not going to look for the hard path. They're going to look for the easy path to performance success. It's just not there. And so the challenge for you is to learn how to work with them, to bring them along, to see that if we teach these people this competency in a generic fashion, by educating people on that competency, if we don't bridge the gap to how to apply it in their workflows, some of them are going to figure it out, but the vast majority are going to struggle with that. And so that's how we can help. We can salvage that investment. They bought the list of competencies. They've got money in it. They want to make use of it. So we need to help them do that. We can't always, I like to say that I have one foot planted in idealism and the other foot is planted in realism, and I lean towards the real. I know where I want to go ideally, but I can't always do that because I've got to work with people with where they are at. And if they've already made that kind of investment in those kinds of systems or tools or anything, I've got to work with that. My boss told me back in 1979, because we measured our impact of performance and we had an impact of 10% performance improvement. And I was disappointed. And she said, "You're too idealistic here. You wanted 100% improvement. You do the math on a 10% performance on that, what those people are doing here. There's millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars that we improve things on because we got 10%. So be happy with that." So, unless we understand how score is kept in the business from financial standpoint, which is something I mentioned to the other class, that's a key thing for people in our profession here. We need to master learning and development, but we also need to understand our clients, the business we're in, the industry we're in, the value chain that we're in, and we need to know how score is kept, and the financial bean counters are the ones keeping score. We also may have to work with the quality organization and understand how do they measure processes and performance, which is what we're trying to improve, but we shouldn't be creating competing models and methods for that when we're already doing those kinds of things in the company. So we need to understand who are the other players, because there's lots of players, human resources, OD functions, that are trying to improve performance. And we need to stay in our lane, but we need to play nicely with the others in the sandbox of performance.
Thanks, Guy.
You're welcome. Nice to meet you.
Well, it's always great to have you, and thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. I have one final question. So after all of these years, do you all agree that you could feel Guy's passion for this? Right? So what after all these years, what continues to inspire you in the field of performance improvement? And two-parter, and what advice or inspiration can you offer to our up-and-coming HPTers?
What has inspired me is the seeing success with the client organization to help the target audience, the performers. We call them learners, but they're really performers. To help performers master their jobs through help such as instruction, performance guides, and or learning experience. They're all instruction. And so helping them perform better is really what is at the root of, most of us are humanists, and so we like to, help the human along in this. I think that, my advice is that you need to learn master, there's a lot of things from the past, from the 60s and even the 50s, um, that have been lost over time, have been rebranded. And so a lot of things that we are being touted as new aren't. They're just renamed. But you can't worry about that when you're new. You need to master what the language is, what the models and methods are in your own organization, and what you've gotten from your schooling, and then learn the alternatives, the what it used to be called, where that comes from. One of the things that's been lost in all the years is what works under what conditions, and under what conditions doesn't it work. And when people have marketeers have rebranded things, um, all of that gets lost because they're trying to tout it as well. We invented this new thing, and so here, and you lose the history of that. And the history that's important is when does it work and when doesn't it work? What are the other variables that need to be in place for that to actually work? And I created a site, HPT Treasures, where I've tried to capture a lot of things from the past thought leaders at ISPI, the International Society for Performance Improvement, um, because I was worried that they had been lost by ISPI, and they actually had been lost by ISPI. And so I went around to a lot of people before they passed on and started gathering articles and things like that so that I could salvage them and make them available for free. So that's an interesting site that you might find of
Amazing.
value. And so but master what's in front of you right now, and then go back and learn the history of where some of these things came from. My I've done a couple podcasts with people about this under the heading of Whoa, Ina. What's old is new again. Whoa, Ina. And so it bothers me because people think that this is brand new, but it's not. And there's a history there, and there's a lot of lessons learned from the past, and it behooves us to figure those things out. But you can't whine about that. You've got to just embrace what's out there now today, um, and and then learn as necessary what those things are from the past. What's the long tail, the history of those interventions or methods or models or tools? Because there's very little that's new under the sun nowadays.
Absolutely true. They're hidden treasures. Thank you for sharing that website with us. If you are okay and everybody's okay with it, love to take a group photo. Yeah, so fix your hair, bring your cameras on. All right, and we'll do a picture in 1, 2, 3. Oh, looking good, looking good. Thank you so much, Guy, once again. I will
You're
share
welcome.
the recordings from Tuesday and tonight. And of course,
And share the PDF and the PowerPoint show that I have if people want
I
to go back
will.
and look at some of, especially those questions. I think that's maybe a good starting point. You probably already have
Yeah,
something, but
yeah,
continue to learn and follow Carl Binder online as well at LinkedIn,
yeah.
etc.
I think so Liliana, come back on. We'll take another picture. I noticed a few of you didn't make the photo. So just give me a second here. There we go. We got more of you on here. Okay, so let's do one more photo. 1, 2, 3. There we go. Even better than the first one. So I'll share this photo with you all. I'll share Guy's information with everyone. Guy, are you open to more LinkedIn requests?
Please do. In my retirement here, I'm still all about helping others, practitioners and leaders, become more performance oriented. So please join me on LinkedIn
Thank you.
and share with your networks.
And continue the conversation. Thank you so much for being here with us.
All right. Thank you.
Bye for
Everybody have
now.
a good night. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.